Well, if you remember, Ed, in Warsaw, governments agreed that they would prepare INDCs and submit those by March next year. And they also agreed that in Lima, they would agree what information needed to be in those INDCs. And so what we're seeing in the ADP sessions is a lot of debate about what information should be in there and whether or not you can differentiate between developed and developing countries in that. So we've seen proposals from Brazil and others which suggest that different countries should provide different types of information in their INDCs. Now, the developed country reactions to that from the US, Norway, Canada, and others have said, well, that, first of all, it prejudges the outcome of the 2015 agreement, but it also sort of reopens something that was agreed in Warsaw and in Durban, which was that all parties should take action to tackle the problem.
And what kind of, watching it quite closely, what kind of level of anger is there in there, or is it quite a sort of calm, constructive process going on inside these tents?
Well, I think what we're seeing are the opening salvos of the 2015 negotiations. And I think there are countries who are playing a long game. They're seeing this as part of the Paris 2015 process, and they're not willing to concede on the differences in the ambition that different countries will have to take on.
And it sounds an obvious question, but what's the interest in this for business and for PWC? Because some of those tents are full of, obviously, the negotiators, but mostly then NGOs following it. So you're slightly unusual coming from business and watching this closely. What's your real interest here?
Well, what countries should say in their INDCs is what level of ambition they have to tackle emissions. And that, I think, is the primary thing that business is interested in. Clearly, the agreement by China and the US and the EU to set targets, long-term targets, is significant for business, because when businesses invest, they need to think about the environment that they're going to be investing in. And those investments are likely to be long-term, whether they're in power generation or building new types of transportation infrastructure. They're long-term investments, and so business is interested in the regulatory environment, that long-term regulatory environment.
And what about the influence of different companies at these talks? Whenever we see business becoming involved, it's usually because NGOs or someone is protesting against their involvement. So, for instance, Shell this week and Chevron taking part in an emissions trading discussion, and some businessmen say we've got no influence here. Some NGOs say there is too much influence here. From your perspective, is there enough interaction between people from the private sector and governments?
From what I see, the activity of the business community has continued in Lima in the way it has done in the COP process over the years. I think business is talking about the scale of the challenge, the scale of technology change and the pace of that change that's needed. Now, some talk about CCS, others talk about renewables. But they also talk about the need for finance and the need to mobilize finance to really achieve that level of change. So I think we will carry on seeing business continuing to be interested and engaged on the debate. And what I would like to see is a calmer debate about the scale of change that's required to deliver the 2-degree goal. Because at the moment there's a lot of antagonism about, is it CCS, is it nuclear, is it renewables, is it energy efficiency? And I think we need to be clear about, if countries are really serious about the 2-degree goal, they need to be serious about the level of technology change that needs to happen to achieve that.
And what's the PwC position on this 2050 decarbonisation target, or a date between 2050 and 2100, where countries could aim to not remove, I guess, all emissions, because that's impossible, but most anyway.
Yeah. I mean, our analysis in our low carbon economy index looks at carbon intensity, so emissions per unit of GDP. And what we find is that to keep to the 2-degree carbon budget, all countries need to decarbonise on average at 6.2% per year. So that's a calculation of splitting that carbon budget over the rest of this century. On the current trajectory, decarbonising at about 1% a year, which is the sort of gain that you would see from energy efficiency. Now, 6.2% may not sound like a lot, but when France switched to nuclear in the 80s, it achieved it over that decade. It achieved 4% decarbonisation. When the US, at the peak of its shale gas revolution a few years ago, it achieved 6.2% for 1 year. It was also in a recession at that time. What we're talking about is that level of change in every sector, every decade. So you have to decarbonise electricity, you have to decarbonise transport, you have to decarbonise those really tricky sectors like cement and steel and chemicals, which could prove much more challenging.